Hello, Pod Smashers of the Internet, and welcome to another episode of
80-bit Pod Smash,
Where Gaming Goes to Grab a Beer. We are your hosts,
Penguin and Termite. I am Penguin.
I am Termite, and we are a weekly video game podcast smashing together ideas that you care about with video games. And tonight we are
talking about the dreaded boss fight. We are talking about boss fights, boss encounters, or just other kinds of encounters. And we'll be talking mostly about the design aspects of boss encounters, bosses and encounters, and just kind of what they add to gaming and how they've been a part of gaming history for a long time. And you can't, oftentimes people when they think of video games, they think of boss fights in a lot of ways, and the villains or the challenges that you face in the game. So that are epitomized by bosses. So yeah.
This is so interesting because we talked about video game lore. We took a break and walked through Halloween and we celebrated it. We had a blast. Now we're back to kind of video game lore and boss fights. They are related in a certain specific way.
Sure.
We're not really going to talk about their relationship, but I mean, this is a kind of follow on to in-game lore.
It's like a weird, it's kind of a series. We also talked about game endings within the last month too. So it's like, ending, how do video games end? Well, sometimes they end with boss fights, and boss fights are a part of the lore. So yeah, there just seems to be a kind of theme as to how we've structured our episodes in the last month or so.
I love it.
Yeah,
love it. But we are where gaming goes to grab a beer. So what are you drinking?
I am just drinking another one of my Rider number 8s, my oldie beer that I had from last week. So I don't really have much more to say about that. It's blonde ale. Yeah, I wish I had something a little bit more folly, but say la vie.
So my wife and I went to Costco. I think we talked about the Oxorcist that I had last week. And the other 4-pack that I purchased with that is what I'm drinking tonight, the Buffalo Bills Brewery Darkest of Them All Black Pumpkin Oatmeal Stout. That is a mouthful of a beer title. I will tell you that right now. It is a stout brewed with pumpkin and pumpkin spice. And the can, I'm going to read it to you, wickedly beautiful. A creamy oatmeal stout with rich layers of pumpkin, spice, and chocolate notes. Black Pumpkin Oatmeal Stout boasts a smooth roasted malt flavor, subtle sweetness, and the aroma of pumpkin creme brulee. And I will tell you, that is the perfect description of what this beer is. And it's not too sweet. I will be the first person to tell you that Sam Adams Jacko I had a couple weeks ago was way too sweet to be a pumpkin beer. This has all those notes: creme brulee, pumpkin, spices, and it is not too sweet. This is incredibly balanced, very smooth, heavily bodied oatmeal stout, and it's only 7%. So it won't even lay you back. You can have a couple of them and be okay.
Nice.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. All right. So we, again, no longer have our news section. We're going to probably be hitting on that early in episodes for a while now, but you can check out this week's news at twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, where we do a live news show. So that will be airing at 8 o'clock tonight if you're listening to this on the Monday it drops, or you can check it out on YouTube later. And again, we always do a live episode Monday nights. So in place of news, you wanted to talk about what we have done this week in our own personal gaming lives, right? So it's kind of a what
I do want to do a what do you plurn, but
okay.
I want to say also you started to guide our audience in the correct direction. Go to 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website. There is a link to our YouTube website. Our channel is there where all of our news live feeds go every single week. They will land there. You can find the latest news up to date, but you are correct. Let's talk about our platinums. What do you plurn? What did you platinum this week?
So I platinumed, it feels like it's been more than a week, but sometime mid last week, I platinumed Infamous Second Son. So
walk me through what is this game? Did you like it? How was the platinum? How were the trophies? What do you feel?
Yeah, I was inspired by, back in July, I played Ghost of Tsushima and I really liked it a lot. And it was made by Sucker Punch, so I wanted to play other games by Sucker Punch. Now, I had Second Son from a PS Plus freebie handout, and so I had played it and tried it long ago and just didn't care for it. So sometime late this summer, I was like, I want to play Second Son. I looked up the platinum. It was a 20-hour platinum, did require 2 playthroughs, but it's a relatively short game, all things considered. So, but I still just really couldn't get into it. I think I streamed it, late this summer and sometime in August, and still just wasn't hooking me. But I worked through some other games on my list. I had some other experiences, and then circled back around to Second Son as a way to kind of snag out a platinum as my game list is starting to get thinner as we get closer to the next gen. So yeah, I knocked it out, and it was a lot of fun. It was pretty easy platinum, all things considered, and really good. Ended up being a really enjoyable game. I really like what Sucker Punch did with that game. Can't speak for the rest of the Infamous series, but we did a Sucker Punch developer profile when Tsushima dropped, and I gotta say, I liked Second Son. I also liked Ghost of Tsushima more, but I liked Second Son as well.
Right, and so Infamous Second Son is actually like Infamous 3.
Yeah,
there was 2 on the PlayStation 3, and this is the third game. It's kind of open world. You explore the city of Seattle. I guess at 20 hours for 2 playthroughs, that's a pretty short game. That's yeah.
The one of the weird things, I will say a big criticism of it, is you unlock concrete powers after you beat the story with the intention of like knocking out all the open world stuff, and then kind of that's where you get your concrete. And that seemed like a weird choice to me. Is like, I really wish I had concrete, like I had that power, and then been able to finish the game with it. Because the way I did the platinum was, I basically did all the open world stuff, all the collectibles, all of the like checkpoints and all the side missions, and then finished the story. So then, like, I think I had like left one collectible out there. So I was like, great, I get to use the concrete for one collectible. Awesome. So that was weird. That was a weird choice. But
so would you recommend for anyone trying to get the platinum in this game to save the collectibles for your second playthrough?
Maybe, yeah. Well, but it's not like a New Game Plus where you keep all your powers. It's a starting over playthrough. So, I mean, maybe do the story first and then have the concrete power to play with when you get the collectibles. That would be maybe the way to go about it. But It's up to you personally. I just thought it was a weird choice. So,
all right.
What I'm playing now is I committed to playing Bloodborne and playing my first Souls-like game for the stream, for the podcast, and ended up getting hooked. I liked it a lot. So I'm almost done with that. With my I'm not going to platinum it or anything. It's too hard of a platinum, but it's not too hard to play through one time. So I'm playing through it, and I'm almost at the boss. So it's fun. I enjoyed it.
The final boss? You're almost done?
Yeah, I'm like a couple bosses away, I think, and then there's a couple side bosses that I might knock out too, just so I can experience the whole content. But yeah, so it's really fun. It was a perfect October game to get into.
Yeah. Speaking of October games, the platinum that I also achieved, platinum number 34, was Until Dawn, about 5 years too late. It came out in 2015, and it was a free PlayStation Plus game as well, and I'd saved it to have people over to help do the decisions together as a group, but COVID wrecked all of that. So I decided in 2020, leading up to a new generation, let me play something quick. Upon looking up the Platinum Guide, I saw it was 12 to 15 hours long for a Platinum. I was like, okay, I can do this. And played through Until Dawn. I did a live stream of that a few weeks ago where chat wanted to desperately text my wife to beat on the window or open a door really hard and loud to scare the bejesus out of me. Luckily, they were not successful. So go check out some avenue of our social media to find that video of me and my live reactions to the gameplay of Until Dawn. I don't do well with scary things in general, and so I was terrified. I was playing by myself here in my basement with the purple lights on in the background. I had a blast. This game is what Scream was to me in high school as a movie, to me today as a video game. It has that campy, that teenage, eroticized, unnecessarily over-the-top, exaggerated, silly, campy, like horror genre done. I'm just using words. I'm throwing words out there to describe this game, and it makes sense. I think it took a while for me to even care about the characters because they're all so bad. The whole group of teenagers, the idea and the premise is that they all go to this mansion. I'm sorry, mansion. That's not a mansion at all. It's a cabin in the woods. And 2 ladies, they're twins, they die, and then 1 year later for their anniversary, where the game really picks up, is the same group of kids. They want to go back and have like a party time in the woods, in the mountains, in the cabins, to like get together again, nostalgia, and kind of respect and honor the death of these 2 twins. And so like the story unfolds, you learn all the mysteries. I'm not going to spoil anything here, but it has depth. It has layers. There's multiple things going on. It's really cool. The story I got engaged in the story after like 4 or 5 episodes in. I was like, I hate these kids. I don't like anything about them. They're all trash, but I want to know what's going on. I want to know who the killer is. I want to know why they're scared. I want to know what is affecting them. And it worked. It clicked. The trophies are super easy. Go online, follow a guide. To your first playthrough is just solely committed to collectibles and keeping everybody alive. If you do those two together, there are decisions that both line up. So there are collectibles that get locked out if you make the wrong decision, but you will not be locked out of a single collectible if you follow the same decisions that keep everybody alive. So you can kill two birds with one stone. You can get all the collectibles and keep everybody alive on your first playthrough. Your second is only a half playthrough of the second half of the game where everybody dies. So you make all the decisions to kill everyone. There's a group of like, I don't know, 6 to 10. I don't know how many kids there are. And the platinum was very attainable. The problem I had with the game is nothing is skippable. So having seen all the cinematics and seen all the dialogue and interactions with everyone, I had to watch it all over and over and over again as I was kind of jumping back and forth between episodes to get the collectibles. And I didn't follow the guides perfectly, but that's why I'm here now telling you, here's what you can do to minimize the time and get a really fast platinum. And by really fast, I mean like 12 to 15 hours is play the game, keep everybody alive, follow a guide to get every collectible the first playthrough through. And then the second playthrough, everyone dies. You'll get all of it. And then there's a third. You just have to play the very last chapter once for a third time to do one more thing. And you'll get the platinum. It's done. It's over. It's a perfect Halloween game. Scary as crap. I threw my controller. I hid my eyes. I threw my headphones off my ears. I was scared. I was happy, kind of excited, but more curious to how the story played out. It's good. It's a good game. Supermassive is the developer, and apparently their follow-ups are not as good, unfortunately. But Until Dawn. That's where I am with that. Yep. Go look that up.
Well, let's stop talking about video games that are our favorite thing and
doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Favorite things.
Favorite things is a chance for us to share with you what we are excited about this week and what we hope you might either be able to recreate or pursue a similar circumstance in hope that you might find your next favorite thing. So we're here to inspire you. What is your favorite thing this week, Termite?
I just talked a bunch. You should go first.
What is your favorite thing, Penguin? Man, there's a couple. There's a few. We'll just sort of throw out the one that probably has had the biggest impact on me this week, which is I passed a test that I had been studying for a long time.
You did, yes.
And am just really, really relieved that it's over, really relieved that I don't have to spend a lot of free time studying, and I don't have to have that occupying my brain space. It is not necessarily a test that anyone should take unless they're in IT, and it was a Microsoft Azure certification, so just an associate level is what it's called. So it's the AZ-104 was the test. If you want to look it up and see what goes into it, you're more than welcome to. But that's not something that necessarily others could share. So what I'll say is a favorite thing that you can share is I made some awesome pumpkin seeds. I carved a pumpkin with my son as sort of the start of a yearly Halloween, hopefully what is a yearly October tradition with him. And he wasn't super into actually carving or, pulling out the pumpkin guts, which I thought he would be into. Instead, I did all that. Instead, once I pulled the pumpkin guts out and put them into a little Tupperware, he wanted to poke the guts with one of the pumpkin scoops or whatever. So I was like, all right. Anyways, I took the seeds. It was a super long drawn out process and almost not worth it. But I took the seeds and I mixed them with Worcestershire sauce, olive oil, garlic powder, onion powder, and a little bit of sesame oil as well. Baked them, and they are an awesome little October snack. I love pumpkin seeds. I love finding recipes to make them even better. So that is my favorite. That is the favorite thing that you can share. That is the exact recipe right there. Go make them and eat them and love them.
My favorite thing, similarly to that, is this past Sunday. For those of you who listen to our podcast regularly, you might know that my wife's in grad school and she requires a lot of time, especially on my weekends where she's able to disconnect from kids and family and just go focus on school. And I gave her that window of time on Sunday after church. I gave her that time to go take a nap, do school. I don't care. I got the kids for the rest of the day and I will put them to bed and you'll have the whole block of time. With that, I have this affinity for kettle corn, when I see the awning that is red with the yellow letters that is kettle corn, whether it's at a farmer's market or a fall festival or a beer tasting event, wherever they are, they're everywhere. They prop up all over the place. I was driving with my son and I saw a kettle corn pop up and I was like, I'm getting some popcorn. This is going to be amazing. I can't wait. I popped in. They had a Halloween themed. This is totally like whatever. Purple and orange popcorn, kettle corn. It was sweet and salty. I got a giant bag of that and another bag of regular kettle corn. And we came back home. And for those of you who don't know, I'm a NASCAR fan. It's weird. I love video games. I'm a computer programmer. I work for a defense contractor in the government doing computer software development. My wife is clinical laboratory scientist. There's nothing in our lives that would ever indicate that I might be a NASCAR fan, which is why it's hilarious to me to think of that contrast, but I am. And my favorite driver is Joey Logano. He drives the number 22 Pennzoil Ford Mustang, and he won the race on Sunday while we were eating this popcorn, and my son was involved, and he was engaged, and he was watching and having fun, and it was just an awesome Sunday to like things in sports were happening that were finally exciting to me. And generally with things like fantasy football and other stuff, I'm more frustrated than excited. And so this was a standout Sunday where I was very excited. My favorite driver won. It puts him in the final 4 drivers will have one chance, one race to win the entire championship for the entire year. That is equivalent to the Super Bowl. It will be the championship for 2020. My favorite driver is now in competition to play with 3 other drivers that have not yet been determined, but he was the first one in the final 4. And so I'm very excited. It was my favorite thing. And that is Termite.
Awesome. Great. Well, that leads us to our next segment, which is
DLC.
Downloadable content is a segment of our show where we have a sub-discussion, as I call it, or a conversation you wouldn't normally have about video games. Sometimes it's related to our main topic, and sometimes it's not. For DLC this week, I want to continue on this train of, we've kind of had a few episodes where we've talked about a like Penguin and Termite video game, if such a thing were to graciously ever exist someday. And we've kind of talked about different things about it. We talked about what would that game look like from a game design standpoint. We've talked about what the ending would look like, and now I want to come up with a couple of bosses for it. So here's the criteria. You have to design the boss based off of the personality of someone who has either been a guest on our show or is one of our regular stream viewers. And I promise you, we will portray you in a honorable, but also completely caricaturized way, a completely caricaturized version of the person who we're designing boss. But I think if our podcast is the game, or like is the meta narrative of our game, then it would be fun to include some of the bigger personalities that we have included in our show, whether it be through listeners who have engaged with us, or whether it be through people that we have had the fortune of having on our show as an interview. So should be fun, and we will make sure to keep it cool, keep it fun. So does that sound good?
Yep, I'm in.
All right, you're in. All right, cool. So do you have one? Do you have an example of boss?
Thinking you put me on the spot. I had no prep for this.
Man.
Like,
I know that's what
I'm
DLC
thinking of the
is.
guests we had on our show, and I'm thinking of all the amazing interviews and discussions we've had over the years, and who would be a boss?
I'll go. And this person I know will take it in good humor, 100%. But our friend Ryan, who is on our caffeine episode, he would absolutely love to be a boss in our game, and he would totally be. What did he say when we interviewed him? What did he make his?
He's a drug dealer.
Was it? Yes, but coffee, like caffeine. He's a caffeine drug dealer, and But what was the name? Was it Java Fiend or something like that? Like
that's his PSN profile with some numbers on it or something.
Yeah, Java Fiend. So that would be the name, is the Java Fiend, and he would be again, like, he's already taller than us in real life, and so he would just be this like gigantic, like looming, exaggerated features, but like wearing a obviously a parody of a Starbucks outfit, like not obviously we would be avoiding any branding that would identify him as a Starbucks employee, or should I say company redacted. But he so he would be wearing the apron, and he would just be like, have giant, like, spilled burning hot coffee on us, but then drink it and get like enraged and like smash us.
Like Torg again?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so yes, that would be the Java Fiend would be one boss. So do you have another one?
My other idea here, and I think he would take it as fun, would be Kevin Benedict.
Yes, I was thinking Kevin as well.
And he would be.
Remind
this is
our
not
listeners,
his personality at all. Like,
our listeners what he was, where
what did we interview him with? What are we talking about?
He was in our beer pairing, remember?
Beer pairing. He is the brewer, the home brewer extraordinaire. He's extremely intelligent. He's very logical, and he's very factual. And he is a zealot for the truth, and that is what I love about Kevin. One of many things, and he wants the truth to be known. So he is very logical and very methodical. And he will be the boss battle of your opinions. Anything you think might be true. Anything you think about anything. Your reaction, your response, how you feel. You will run it through Kevin. And he will spit back to you why you are factually wrong. And critique every aspect of your opinion.
And you're always factually wrong. So Penguin and Termite will encounter this boss, and then he'll be like, tell me your opinions on such and such. And then you have a selection of options, and every single one of them is like definitely wrong.
Yep. And they're all wrong, and then you have to provide a proof.
Wrong, and then and you have to beat him by, there's some mechanic involving picking the right beers, and then offering them to him.
No. You defeat him by subverting his ability to logic his way out of an argument. And you end up getting him fallacy
drunk. By getting him drunk.
Yeah, it could involve that. That could very well. That is a legitimate way. That is one of many ways.
Stop bringing me
Kevin.
Such good beers.
Bring him ridiculously good beers, and he's like inebriated and cannot.
You have to collect them in the dungeon beforehand. So in the dungeon that you're in, you have to go collect and make sure you pick out the right ones, because there's a certain combination that he'll be like, you brought me Goose Island, or should I say Company Redacted? I love Company Redacted, and he'll drink them, and then slowly he'll get more and more drunk over time until he passes out. I love it. It's perfect.
It's fantastic.
And to go back to Ryan, our Java Fiend, he would be like, you should have had me on an episode about storytelling. Crush. We placate him by promising to include him in an episode that he wants to talk about instead of his job. So great, those are our boss designs for a video game. So anyone who's a game developer out there that wants to make a video game of us, we've just given you all of the ideas already. So just make it. The game's already basically made, so it makes itself. So make it happen. We will bless you.
We love our guests. We love our interviews. We love the people we have on our show. And I hope that it is taken in good taste and fun and goodwill to those who are listening on our show.
Absolutely. Yes. We caricaturize you out of complete and utter adoration and honor that you are part of our family. So, and you can joke with your family. So yeah. I thought T-Bone might have showed up, so we'll have to save T-Bone for another time.
Bonus number 3.
All right, so that leads us to our main topic. We are talking about video game boss and video game encounter design. It does, like I said, tie in kind of to our discussion about endings, only because so many video games end on a boss, but many video games have bosses throughout, so it's not exclusive to just endings as well. And many video games have encounters throughout as well. So even if they're not specifically bosses, there's usually some kind of challenge that you have to overcome that tests your skill. So what are bosses and encounters? How are they similar and how are they different?
Boss encounters. In video games, a boss is a significant computer-controlled enemy. A fight with a boss character is commonly referred to as a boss battle or a boss fight. Bosses are generally far stronger than other opponents the player has faced up until that point, and winning requires a greater knowledge of the game's mechanics. Boss battles are generally seen as a climax of a particular section of the game, such as the end of a level or a stage, or guarding a specific objective. That is the definition according to Wikipedia, which I think sums up all aspects of our conversation we're going to have tonight.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yep.
Did you say the first boss? Did you say the thing about the first boss battle?
Nope. Go ahead.
Great. Awesome. So Wikipedia lists the first boss battle as being from, I just refreshed Evernote and I should not have done that. Go ahead and read it, Termite.
According to Wikipedia, the first boss battle ever featured in a game was the Gold Dragon in the 1975 RPG Dungeons & Dragons, and the practice has been going strong ever since.
That's right. Okay, so I refreshed it because the changes didn't show up, and they're back now, but I had to click through a bunch of stuff to get there.
A little inside baseball to 8-bit Pod Smash.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, so bosses... Like, how are they, they're similar to encounters in that, they are an encounter. It's kind of like one of those things where it's like all bosses are an encounter, but not all encounters are bosses, I think. And they both kind of, test that skill that you've gotten up to that point, knowledge. Sometimes if it's a multiplayer game, they'll test your teamwork, your ability to communicate and work as a team. That's basically the bread and butter of MMOs, right?
It's usually the epitome of the game. So depending on the genre of game, so if you're playing an MMO, that's going to be a massively multiplayer online RPG. It's an MMORPG, right? So you're playing with folks, you're playing with friends. You have spent hours and hours and hours deliberating over your character and how you're going to build it. And so a boss fight in an MMORPG is going to be the epitome of that game genre and that game mechanics, and it's going to be the thing that tests every aspect of your build and your party's build.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what a boss fight is.
Sure. They're almost always in single player games or cooperative multiplayer games. Like, you don't see there are examples of boss fights in, there's some kinds of boss fights, like they're experimenting more with like PvPvE. I know Destiny did a PvPvE mode where it was two teams competing to kill computer-controlled enemies and bosses, and then they could like jump between their worlds and attack each other as well. But like, that's a kind of new thing. That would include boss battles, but you don't see bosses necessarily in Fortnite, although you could argue that like there was the Thanos event where a player controlled a boss, but that's still a player-controlled character. So yeah, it's not something that's quite... What I'm trying to say is it's not something that's in every video game, obviously.
Right.
The bosses, quote unquote, in a Call of Duty are just the players you're playing against. They're the ones who are challenging, and that is the most challenging thing in a game. In that game, it's the epitome of that game's challenge. Whereas single player games will also test that by giving you a computer controlled enemy that tests those things, that has a significant amount of strength or design that you have to, prove yourself to beat. And there's wide varieties and a wide gap between like some of the difficulties. Bosses in Bloodborne are way more challenging on the whole than bosses in Zelda, but their design often is the same, even if that difficulty is ratcheted up or down depending on the context. So encounters... Sounds
like what you're saying is that difficulty is independent of a boss.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's not just hard things. It's meant to do a couple things, right? And we'll get into that. We'll get into all that. I will say that I included the word encounters here because I also wanted to talk about the fact that, like, again, not all of the greatest challenges in a game are a big boss. Sometimes it's like we talked about this in game endings. Sometimes it can be a gauntlet, a race of some kind. Sometimes it can be a group, like a horde mode. You have to survive through waves of enemies that get harder and harder and harder. But it's still accomplishing the same thing, which is testing your skill and testing what you've learned effectively so far. Make sense?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about the why then. We talked about what, so let's talk about why. Why are bosses and encounters such an integral part of overall game design? What do they bring to the table? What do they add to games? Why do they make games better?
Bosses and encounters add so much to a game. We're going to get into so much of this. What do they add to games? I feel like this is the overall question to your entire conversation, and we have all the following questions are going to answer all the little tidbits to this. So the high-level answer, why are bosses and encounters such an integral part of the overall game design? Overall game design of each individual title depends on what the goals of that title are. And if you're telling a single-player story, usually a boss or an encounter is going to be a climactic event. If you're telling a not so big single player story, maybe they're just story beats, like chapter after chapter of a book you would read, but represented in video games. So it's a boss you would defeat. It would be the things you've learned about in that world or in that level and it would be like multiple beats, rise and fall, rise, fall, rise, fall in the story. And what do they add to games? They use everything you have. If you're a good game designer, you will have taught the gamer multiple things about your game, from the mechanics to the skill trees to the development, character development, and you will test those things. So what does that add to the game? The player is engaged in a way that's like, do I have the best build? Am I good enough? Have I leveled up enough? Am I strong enough to beat this thing? Can I use everything the game has to throw at me, whether it's what I've learned from the video game manual that I'm reading in the instruction booklet, or if it's through grinding hours and hours and hours of fighting easy enemies and like leveling up to get to this like epic encounter. Through storytelling and game design, you have both aspects of what bosses and encounters. In MMOs, you have like the ability to get 40 people together in like a World of Warcraft raid. And those 40 people are subdivided into groups. Have they optimized how their roles are in damage dealing and healing and tanking? Do they know what they're doing? Do they know this? Have they studied this boss's patterns? Do they know what this boss is doing? Can they work together as a giant team to rotate tanks in, to rotate healers in when they think about damage per second and the cooldowns and the healing and how much mana they have and how much tanking can handle HP burn as they lose HP and lose defense? Can the healers handle healing the tanks? Can the damage dealers go in and do the damage they have to do, and the buffs they have to do, and the crowd control and dealing with all the ads? Ads are additional enemies that the main boss might summon. There's a lot with bosses and encounters that test every aspect of your game.
Yeah, I think not just testing the players, but also like allowing the developers to play with what the game is capable of, right? So creating variety, and it's like, okay, well, if you're going to, it allows developers to include variety in their game when they think about like, okay, what do we want the players to be able to do, to be able to accomplish? What variety of gameplay do we want to emphasize, and what skills do we particularly want to reinforce? And so you can get a more interesting, what ultimately the end result is you get more interesting variety in gameplay, whether that's like, okay, we're going to introduce some cool new weapons and things, cool new items that will encourage the players to try different strategies when they encounter a boss they have a hard time with, and stuff like that. And then allow for, they also, like you said, allow for sort of cinematic moments to happen, and allow for, so one boss might be, you're just sort of sitting there in a tight room and you have to try to work with the room you have. You can't dodge as much. So you're forced to have to learn how to block. It's that kind of game, or you're forced to try to just, maximize your damage as much as possible to get the boss down. Whereas the next boss might be in a wide open area where you have to chase him around. So you have to like emphasize movement. And if it's a group game, you have to emphasize moving as a team. So yeah, just allowing that variety of gameplay to keep the game interesting between encounters, I think is what they add. So what are some of the design considerations that go into making interesting boss encounters, kind of beyond what we were talking about before?
The boss should feel like the reward. The boss should feel like a goal or a milestone for the player. By fighting a boss, a player can demonstrate his mastery of a game. A boss fight can help build and release tension in a satisfying way. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways design considerations go into interesting bosses or encounters. And so without even addressing the single versus multiplayer aspect of those things, because each of those four goals are different for single player games than multiplayer games. So we'll start with single player first. The boss should feel like a reward. When I said earlier, it's like a mid, like when you read a book, you have a chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and there could be 20 chapters, but each chapter has a concise kind of story within it that builds to a greater story. And so you should feel rewarded for every boss you fight, whether it's as simple as an item reward, like in Zelda, when you go into a dungeon and you get the item in that dungeon, you're going to need to beat that boss. When you are back out into the main world, you now have that weapon with which to explore new avenues and new things. In Metroid, what's coined as the Metroidvania. You find things in the world like weapons that will allow you to open new doors. When it's a super missile that opens green doors, like you can do that now. but you will use that super missile in a unique way against a certain boss, so you get a reward for that. A goal or a milestone in storytelling. Here's this antagonist that has been in the story, in the narrative, in the plot, that has been causing grief and struggle and strife with the protagonist. And so it could be a sub boss, it could be the main boss, however it works. You have a goal or a milestone that you complete. You're like, oh, I beat this thing. Final Fantasy games do that really well. Even Zelda games do that really well. And then just demonstrate mastery of the game. Each boss fight usually uses the different mechanics of the game. I'm going to go back to Zelda a lot, like Ocarina of Time, for example. It's Z targeting and dodging and blocking and parrying. You have Bloodborne in your recent just like video game experience, so like you can use Bloodborne as an example of this. Ghost of Tsushima as well. It's like the bosses in that game will exercise every aspect of the mechanics that's been given to you. You will use every skill you have. You will block perfectly. You will parry perfectly. And this boss is strong and hard, and you'll spend time here fighting this one antagonist that will demonstrate your mastery of everything the game has taught you thus far.
Yeah.
And then building and releasing tension. And so like, in the storytelling, in the plot, in the narrative, the stuff that's outside of your mechanics, when you set the controller down to watch a cutscene and you see the dialogue and you're invested in this character, you're invested in this world, you care what's happening, you're emotionally connected, you will have both the building and releasing of tension in a great way that moves you, that causes you to respond, that has something that invokes something in you, is what boss fights do. And that can be the end of a game. That's the ending. And so afterward you have the prologue, or it could be at the very beginning of the game. It could be the introduction. It could be the prologue where you just finished the tutorial stage essentially, and you fight the first boss of the game, and you have this build and release of tension. And now you can go out and explore the rest of what the game has to offer. Either way, you still have that like anticipation and release of tension kind of centering on a boss encounter, and bosses are unique in that way.
Yeah, I also, when I think of this question, I think of like the design that reinforces boss design. So other game aspects that will make bosses either more challenging or less challenging, or more or less rewarding. And I think of, again, Bloodborne is fresh in my mind because the bosses in that are really the epitome of the difficulty. But like, they do a really good job of every time you beat a boss, you get a checkpoint. You get one of those coveted checkpoints that allow you to go back to, you know, the vendors and everything to make your character stronger and buy stuff. So yes, it is. They build, like you said, like you're talking about, they build the tension, and then they give you a nice moment of relief when you beat it, because you know, great, I can come right back here when I literally have advanced myself forward and no longer am stuck on this boss. So depending on, in a game like Bloodborne, you may have fought that boss over and over and over again. So doing that. So again, that's like a consideration to think about. I think of how they, like, again, thinking of World of Warcraft as another example, you have different raids, you know, over time, they would have like more or less forgiving, you know, like, you've got to re-clear the trash, the trash mobs, because now you've all wiped and lost, so you have to go back to a certain point. Like, you have to run back from the graveyard, right? And then how do we design the level to make it so that you don't have to go through everything you've just gone through to try again, right? So the idea of trying again, like, bosses should be, even in games that are easier, bosses should be challenging enough to, you know, make you fight them a couple times, but with the understanding that when you're fighting them over and over again, some aspects of that can get tedious. So is there a cutscene? Can you skip that cutscene? You know what I mean? So things like that will reinforce how enjoyable or less enjoyable a boss ends up being, because if you hear the same dialogue over and over and over again because you just are hitting a wall with a boss, then that can be irritating to the player after time. There are bosses where I'm like, I could still probably quote you the exact lines that they say every time because I was forced to listen to it over and over again. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is an aspect of boss design, or rather game design, that aren't necessarily the boss itself, but will either reinforce or tear down the boss design to make it more or less enjoyable for the player.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, I didn't know if you had any examples of that either, but
nope.
Well, cool. Well, what about multiplayer and single player? Like, what are what are aspects of boss design that are similar or different in multi versus single player games?
We'll get into more depth of the single player aspect of what bosses are when you say in the next question, breaking that down. But for multiplayer, the biggest variable is the player to player aspect. You know, every party consisting of individuals is going to be a lot different. So when you are a single player, you are fighting the AI. It's very easy to control that. The AI is going to represent this challenge and the player has to beat it. When you design a multiplayer challenge in like MMORPGs or player versus player type situations, you have the massive variable that is completely unpredictable, and that is a person. And that is a party of people and how they're going to behave. And you can restrict their level of choice based on the game itself. So game design can restrict, what a player is capable of accomplishing. And so you think about an MMORPG again, the role of a tank. A tank is going to have a high health and high defense. And you're going to have a role to take aggro. And that is the attention of the enemies. Your role as a tank is to take on the attention of the enemies with your HP and your defense and hit and take all the hits. You want to be the center of attention. And then the role of the healer is going to be the person that heals that tank to make sure they're not dead. And then damage dealers are going to come out and they're going to deal damage. And there's all this stuff around all of that. But what the unknown variable is how well do those players communicate? How well can they time their attacks and their cooldowns and the things that, the restrictions that are in place on the game? The unknown variable is how well they can be as a person.
Right. And some games will some designers will choose to limit that communication. So I think of a game like, it's not really a game with bosses necessarily, but Journey, for example, like they limit severely. You can't just hop in voice. I mean, I suppose you could if you were able to confidently know you would be paired up with someone, but like you can't. So like you can't just jump into voice chat and be like, oh yeah, come this way, man. Like follow me over here. It's like you have to do it through the internal pinging system and the internal communication that the players develop themselves. And I think a lot of games are experimenting with that more. And so yeah, but like again, does the game design can no longer take for granted necessarily that people are going to get on voice chat. So in many cases, they will include pinging systems that like Apex Legends included the pinging system and stuff like that to reinforce that multiplayer communication. Because communication is so crucial. And then like also the ability.
Public communication apparently is diminishing as a culture, as a thing. It's a side note. I'm sorry. I'm interrupting you. This is a total tangent. But apparently like if you statistics and things prove that like the public voice chat is diminishing. So the random dude or girl who's online interacting with random folks who they don't know is going away. A lot of people are now using mute. Microphones are more muted now than they've ever been. And so now game designers have to fight that too. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that, again, that goes into play because, I mean, I've seen that in my own life. Like, even I am less inclined. I used to, again, back in my WoW days, I'd like meet all kinds of new people and always chat with them and talk with them and make new friends. And nowadays I'm like, I just don't want to deal with it. I don't have the mental capacity to want to even deal with it because for every like cool person you meet, you're going to meet someone who's just a complete difficulty to deal with. Mm-hmm. Just to put that most politically, it's just, again, you're just dealing with different personalities, and different goals and desires. So I know for myself that that's diminished in my life as well. But again, there's also the aspect too of like multiplayer game design will often have to factor into the consideration of like, can we make this challenging in order for players to facilitate community by teaching one another? And by, and that can also bite you in the butt because then you'll have the toxic players who are like, why aren't you good? Get good, scrub. Like, oh gosh, you're dragging this whole team down. You're the worst. As opposed to like some players will be like, okay, well, like you're obviously struggling with this. Like you're standing in the fire a lot. Can I help teach you how to not stand in the fire? So now you're seeing games include like accolade systems where if you are grouped with someone and they were helpful, you can actually mark them and say this player was incredibly helpful and they'll get rewards based on how well and how helpful they are. So there's all kinds of, we're seeing this sort of evolution. We're seeing the fact that like you said, there's this phenomenon that's evolving where people are less communicative in general, and then they game designers are responding by saying, okay, well, how can we implement systems that still facilitate community without having to necessarily rely on solely voice chat and for the community to sort of police itself on its own. So that's all going into game design.
Yeah, it's interesting how game design will affect that, because you can put restrictions on each of the class roles. You can put restrictions on how many people can group together. Like, as a game designer, there's countless ways you can kind of entice, enforce, and push people into and restrict folks into how they're going to play their game together. And we're seeing that with Ghost of Tsushima Legends now as we played it. And there's limited ways in which you can customize your character. There's limited ways in which you can exercise your role as a healer or as a samurai, as an assassin being stealthy, or as a hunter being ranged. And so, like, that's kind of the evolution of multiplayer. We haven't really found the hard bosses yet, but I imagine the more difficult waves, like the bronze, silver, gold tiers of things. The gold tier will be nuts. And will require.
I think the real like boss design will be in the raids they're planning. They haven't released yet. Yeah, and those are going to be like, oh, that's a boss. That's a boss design. That's an entirely new thing we haven't seen yet. Yeah, for sure. I hope so, at least. That's what I'm hoping for. So my next question here is: so there's this idea of a boss being a quote check. So you'll hear this. This boss is a movement check. This boss is a teamwork check. This boss is a damage check or healing check, tank check. You hear that language in multiplayer games, MMOs, and stuff like that. I think it applies to single player games as well. So what does it mean for an encounter or a boss to be a quote check, and what does that look like?
Sure. A lot of my research has came from this article on Gama Sutra by Mike Stout. So I would go give him the click for this. I don't know when it was written, years ago probably, but what does it mean for a boss or encounter to be a check? There's a couple of things. One is the boss is a test. And that is a test the player's skill. Two, the boss is a story in and of itself. And we'll get to that in a minute. We'll change the conversation to talk about the story of a boss fight and its evolution. But first, I want to talk about how a boss is a test. So make a list. This is from a developer or a designer's point of view. Here's a boss. We're going to make him a test or her a test. Make a list of skills you want to test the player on. So like we mentioned earlier, the player has been taught mechanics of the game. How do you swing a sword? How do you build your character's skill tree? How do you move in the world? We're going to put all that together. How do you dodge? How do you parry? And we're going to test the player on those things. Make a list of attacks or challenges that will test that specific skill. If you want to test Z targeting in the Ocarina of Time, you'll need to have multiple targets. And if you want to test the Z targeting, you'll then time each of those targets to attack the player at a specific time so that the player can learn to change their target as they Z target those things. That's very rudimentary. It's very fundamental. It happened in 1998, right? Today we have more evolutions of that.
Yeah, and the Zelda one's a great example because, like you said earlier, they give you a weapon like an item in each one, and then the boss is usually a check of that like of your skill with that. The dungeon teaches you how to use it and gives you circumstances and different puzzles that you use that weapon to solve, and then the boss is kind of the final puzzle of that. So Volvega was the Megaton Hammer check, King Dodongo was the bomb check. Morpha, was it Morpha? Is that his name? Was the hookshot check? So, like, yeah, they're all designed to test you on the skills that you've learned up to that point with that particular weapon or particular item.
Yep. And then you'll also decide how the boss defends itself. And so you'll also have defenses put out that will, again, check the player's ability to be able to exploit weaknesses in timing or weaknesses in dodging, parrying, counterattacking, attacking at the right time when there's an exploit that's exposed. So boss encounters allow you to explore as a designer all of those avenues. When you think about the hook shot, how it pulls away armor, and then you have like things that attack the player in ways that cause them to dodge or parry, and then leave yourself open to a timing attack. So all that stuff is kind of a check on the player.
Right.
How well have you been paying attention to this game?
Absolutely. And in multiplayer games, it's also, again, you have that team element, and you often, again, these multiplayer games that often have bosses are also frequently games that include a more expansive world as well, so it'll also test your preparation. So, I think, I'll always go back to World of Warcraft as my baseline example of this because of how influential it was for my gaming history. But like, there were bosses in every raid that were the DPS check. And it was the actual mechanics of the boss were fairly simple, but the boss was designed in such a way where if you reached a certain time limit, you were going to die no matter what, no matter how skilled your healers were, no matter how skilled your tank.
Yep.
There's some kind of wipe mechanic where it was like, if you don't do enough, if you literally do not deal out enough damage, then you will lose. So it was a check of like, are all of your people geared enough? Are they using potions? Are you layering on the buffs in such a way that you are maximizing your damage throughput, and is everyone pulling their weight? And that is the damage check. There's the tank check that does the same thing. Like, it's designed in such a way where your tanks will eventually take so much damage they will die and your party will wipe. So are your tanks geared? Same thing with healers. But then there would also be things like, they would check and test your teamwork. So like, I think my favorite example of this was Hygen the Unclean was a boss in Naxxramas where the players called his primary mechanic the dance, and he had a trophy or an achievement associated with him called the safety dance. And it was basically like you had to move as a group through these sections. Like, as one would become more dangerous, you had to coordinate the movement between, like, from one part of the room to another, essentially, or you would die and you would wipe and everyone would lose, and it would be time wasted. So that's a classic movement check. It's checking your ability to move and coordinate that movement as a group. And it's a great example of that. So, really testing your preparation essentially as a group. And so those are the different kinds of checks that you would find. But yeah, they're essentially tests. But you also brought up the idea. What's interesting
is you've highlighted like 3 different aspects of what a boss can do. The first thing was gear. So to get gear in a multiplayer game, you need to put time in. You need to commit. And so there is a level of commitment that is a reward to a player, regardless of boss fights, that allows you to gear up. And that gear usually is a single score or some sort of, if you're a damage dealer, it's DPS. If you're a healer, it's how much healing you can do. If you're a tank, it's how much HP and damage you can take, and those 3 aspects. And so like, just by putting the time in, you can develop your character enough to be able to be satisfactory in that role. The second thing is player ability. It's the ability to react to a boss's actions, attacks, responding to the things that they need to do. If it's a dance fight, if the boss is doing a explosive that's an area of effect, it's AoE damage where there's a circle or radius. If you're a tank, get outside of that. If you're a damage dealer, you stand back for a moment. If you're a healer, you get out of the range. But if you're a healer, you also know or are aware of the things that attack 100%. This boss is going to deal a spell that's going to hit all of the tanks a certain way. And if you're a healer, you need to conserve your mana in advance and know that this boss is going to do the thing. So that's a mechanical thing. So like I said, the first thing is time spent and investment into building your character. The second thing is learning the game and the mechanics. And the third thing is the social aspect of communicating with a team that allows you to be able to talk to folks and execute a strategy and a plan effectively.
Yeah.
And
it's
all really, 3 of those things are very unique to a multiplayer MMORPG, a boss encounter, but they epitomize everything the game has to offer. Yeah. Everything. Yep. It's and so good.
Even in single, you see those things in single player games minus the sort of communication. Like most bosses will check your minimum time invested, whether it's time invested learning the game, time invested grinding out experience or grinding out items that help you fight them, whatever it is, there's some minimum time check. There's a minimum skill check, which is like, do you have the basic skills necessary? And again, we've talked for a long time about how game developers are starting to widen that gap, not necessarily to make things easier, but to make things more accessible for people who may have innate disabilities or disadvantages, to still allow them to show that they're still skilled players, even if they have those disadvantages. So it tests your innate skill. It checks that innate skill, and then it checks that innate knowledge too, like you said, where it's like, there's also an aspect of like, have you learned the lessons that they've taught you? And then in some cases, have you researched outside of the lessons to figure out how to, if it's a game that has builds, have you maximized the effectiveness of your build? Have you, and that revolves some either direct testing or research. Do you know the different phases of the boss? Do you know how the boss changes throughout the game and how to react to those things. So it's like skill, knowledge, and time checks are almost a boss is either, sometimes it'll emphasize one of those things over the other, but all of them are sort of minimum checks on those things. And then the one aspect that multiplayer adds is that coordination. Are you coordinating and working together as a group? And some bosses will check that more than others, but yeah. So you mentioned the idea of how sort of a check can mean that the boss is testing certain skills, but you also mentioned the idea of a story. And I wouldn't necessarily use the word check for that, but I will use the word phase. And multi-phasic bosses, where the boss changes throughout the encounter to become more difficult. So either they sprout a third arm, or they start charging they switch into a mode where they're charging. All that helps kind of build the story of the fight, and then allows for changing of strategy that only reinforces that story, because you as the player are like, oh crap, suddenly I now have to do this, whether it's pull out a different weapon or pull out a shield or group up together with your other characters or whatever, or you have to cast, if it's an RPG turn-based, I'm casting barrier on all my people. It suddenly forces a change of your strategy that only reinforces the feeling of this fight being a story. We talked about that in stage combat when I was learning that back in my theater days, is like every fight in and of itself is a story. There's like, oftentimes people like treat fights as like, just like, okay, and then they fight, and then the story continues, like a pause in the story almost, when the reality is like, no, to get from point A to point B in a fight is a story. Like, they are things, sequences, events are unfolding. It's a story that's not told with words, but told with action. And that's the same thing in video game design too. A story should be, or a boss fight should be a story as well.
It is. And looking at, I'm going to follow Gama Sutra's article that I quoted earlier. I hope I can remember to link off to it. If you guys don't see the link to that, please reach out and get it, because what's the author, Mike Stout, put this perfectly. So the storytelling of a boss fight can be broken up into these categories: the build-up, the introduction and reveal, business as usual, escalation, midpoint, it's on, the kill and defeat sequence, and the victory sequence. And I'm going to walk you guys through The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in all of these. And specifically with the last boss of Ganon, which actually starts as early as halfway through the game. So the last boss of the game, the story starts halfway through it. So you think about like the entire game itself, split it in half. The final boss fight story actually starts at the halfway point, and that's when you fight Phantom Ganon. And that's at the forest dungeon as soon as Link is an adult. Part of the way through the game, the player fights a boss battle against a ghost that takes the form of Ganon. The battle teaches the player that he can reflect Ganon's yellow energy back at him, which is a mechanic you'll use at the very end of the game.
I was going to say, I would argue that they introduce him at the end, when at the castle, but that's for at least the story aspect of it. But yeah, the mechanical story of how the fight's going to go, that's definitely introduced.
Yeah, I'm breaking this down into like the actual boss fight. So when you look at the final boss, the boss fight, the very first time you've ever been introduced to any mechanic that is introduced into the final boss fight is when you fight him in the forest world.
Got it. Okay,
forest dungeon. Right. So the introduction and the big reveal is when the player finally encounters Ganon face to face. Ganon casts a horrible spell at Link, rises into the air, and cackles maniacally. The words "Great King of Evil" Ganondorf appear on the screen below him. So that's the big reveal. This is the Great King of Evil, Ganondorf. So as you progress through Ocarina of Time as a child, in the first 3 dungeons, you only learn of Ganondorf as kind of this mysterious, nasty, antagonistic force that's kind of ethereal and like not real. And then you fight the phantom version of that in the forest dungeon. It's a phantom Ganon, so you think of him as kind of a dream. It's kind of a vision. You don't really like have that tangible thing. Well, the actual introduction of that, the thing that really hits home, is when you see him for the first time as the Great King of Evil, Ganondorf.
Yeah, because like so many games are playing with this idea, because like sometimes the enemy you think is going to be the boss isn't the boss. So I think of Borderlands, where it's like the first Borderlands game, where from starting the halfway point, you're introduced to the character Commandant Steele, and she's this evil siren, and you're like, okay, we're gonna fight her. Obviously, she's the big bad, right? And then like when you get to that final encounter, she gets gutted and you end up fighting the destroyer instead. So like that intro is important because it's the confirmation of who you're fighting is the boss right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming business as usual is when you're like, okay, well, so you begin the fight and you realize, okay, this is the primary mechanic of the fight. This is what's
hilarious, because like the halfway point of the game is when you see Ganon for the first time as an actual villain, but the business as usual doesn't happen until the end. And it's the very first time you encounter Phantom Ganon, but not as a phantom. It's Ganondorf, and it's in the castle. It's right there at Hyrule. It's after you have completed every single dungeon in the game. You know you're at the end. You know this is the last boss.
Right. And the business as usual applies to the fact that you're like, okay, I know how to do this. You as the player are like, okay, I know how to do this. This is what the fight is. That changes when you get to the escalation, which in the case of Ganondorf is when he slams the ground and pieces of the platform start to, the range at which you have to fight him starts increasing or the gap between you and him increases because he's removing parts of the platform that you're on in order to fight. The midpoint, I guess, in Ganondorf's case would be when you beat him the first time and you're like, okay, cool, we've won. And then you have the whole chase through the not chase, but the collapsing of the tower.
Yep.
Only to reveal this. You might think, oh, this is the defeat sequence, right? Like, nope, it's not. That's the twist in Ocarina of Time. It is the midpoint of the battle. The it's on moment is when he emerges from the wreckage of the tower and transforms into Ganon. And that's the it's on moment. So a lot of boss fights have something similar to that, where you've reached a point where suddenly it's, as the player, you have that sinking feeling in your gut where you're like, oh gosh, this is going to be tough. I think another good example is the player is
deprived of his main weapon for most of the fight. You must use 2 alternative weapons to damage the tail. The player's being tested on his attacking or her attacking, dodging, bow and arrow shooting, identification of weak spots, basic movement. All of this is under a test right now, and at this point in the game, when it's quote when it's on, right? You're fighting this big, massive Ganon monster.
Yeah.
And then you move on to the kill sequence. After hitting him in the tail one too many times, the player brings Ganon to his knees. Zelda calls for you to finish it, and the player thrusts his sword into Ganon's face. Zelda and all the NPCs you've rescued band together and cast a spell to bind Ganon to prison forever. Ganon plummets into the prison, screaming for revenge, but it's all over for him. And then you go on to the victory sequence, which is kind of the epilogue. My favorite aspect of every video game storytelling ever is the epilogue. That's Termite's favorite thing ever. After Ganon is pulled into his prison for all time, Zelda thanks the player for all that he or she has done and reminds him or her how amazing he or she is. And that's kind of the victory sequence. So in of itself, a boss fight for that game, Portal is another example that they use. You can use BioShock as another example, God of War. I mean, every good video game, anything with a good design, the boss fight, the antagonist, is a story that is built up from the very beginning of what the player experiences through the very end. The build-up, the introduction, the business, the escalation, the midpoint, the fight, the kill, the victory. It's all a cohesive story in and of itself.
And it includes those things like cinematics and stuff like that to reinforce each part of that fight and really build that tension appropriately. So cool. All right, well, that's basically our episode on bosses. We had a few more questions, but we are out of time for them. So we want to hear what your thoughts are. We want to hear what your feedback is on bosses. So what are your favorite boss encounters? What are boss encounters you think have good design? What are boss encounters that you think have bad design? Whether you like them or not, what are your feelings on this topic of boss design? Do you think bosses are the absolute worst? Do you think bosses are the absolute greatest? We want to hear that feedback. So, Termite, where can the listeners give us their feedback if they have it?
As you have heard earlier tonight on this podcast, you can go to 80bitpodsmash.com. It's our landing website where we have links to Spotify, Google Play. Is that what it's called now? Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can find links to any of our podcast platforms there. You can find links to our YouTube page, our social media platforms, our Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit, Twitter. all at 80bitpodsmash.com. You can find us on twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash on Wednesdays and Monday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we do our news show on Mondays and our video game live streams on Wednesdays. We also have a link to our Discord server in all of our show notes on that goes live on Facebook as well and Twitter. You can find links to Discord. You can interact with us there. We promise to read every single one of our Apple Podcast reviews for 80-Bit Pod Smash, because that helps. If you guys go and leave us a review, like and subscribe to all of those things that you care about for us. If you go to Apple Podcasts, that's the biggest platform there is. Leave us a review. We will read it on the show. We promise to. It's a family-friendly podcast. We try to stay out of adult territory, but we will censor you if we have to. However, whatever you say, whatever your star rating is, we will read it on the show. You will get publicity. You will be recognized. Please go to Apple Podcasts and rate us, 80bitpodsmash.com. Give us a rating. Give us a feedback, and we will interact with you.
Cool. All right, next week we're going to be bringing back our Soul in the Console episodes series, and we will be starting a new round, a new manufacturer, and so we will be doing an episode celebrating the original Xbox. And yeah, that's the plan for next week. So
the reason being is because a whole new generation is upon us. Both the November 10th Xbox Series XS launch and November 12th is the PlayStation 5 launch. We're saving our Soul and console on PlayStation for later. We're going to jump into Xbox World because it is kind of the backseat driver we want to bring to the front. We want to explore the opposite platform than we're usually part of, and so we're going to jump into Microsoft Xbox. We're going to see why it's relevant to the gaming industry, why it matters that Microsoft brought the Xbox to the console market, and connect that to the Series X.
Yep, awesome. So we'll have that November 9th, and we'll see you then.
See you next week!